36. Conquering the beast of depression. Depressions are a group of disorders universally marked by low energy and a mood often described by the person as sad, blue, discouraged, or down in the dumps. Depressive syndromes are characterized by a wide array of symptoms. There is always a persistent change in behavior, with loss of interest or pleasure in nearly all activities, and this may be accompanied by feelings of worthlessness, hopelessness, and helplessness. Often depressions are marked by a pervasive sense of emptiness and deprivation, as well as anxiety. The individual may have an impaired ability to think, concentrate, or make decisions, and in severe cases there may be thoughts of death, suicide, or suicide attempts. Depression is the most common mood disorder that comes to the attention of physicians. In 2005, about 10 million Americans had a major depressive disorder. Throughout history, fanciful terms were adopted in the description of different complaints we now call clinical depression. Neurasthenia, bespoke nervous exhaustion. From before the time of Hippocrates and up until the middle of the 19th century, physicians believed that health depended upon a balance between various body fluids, or humors. Melancholia was attributed to an excess of black bile, from the Greek melon, meaning black, and chole, bile. The humors theory finally crumbled with the advance of cellular pathology by Rudolf Virchow in the middle of the 19th century, but it lingers in the terms ill humor and good humor. Treatments toward the end of the 19th century and extending well into the 20th century included electrotherapy, hydrotherapy, rest, diet, and massage. Inhibitors. The breakthrough in discovering antidepressants and ultimately understanding the chemical basis of depression arose from an interlocking series of chance experiences. First among these was the accidental discovery of what became known as MAO inhibitors. On a spring Sunday in 1953, Nathan Kline, a psychiatrist who was director of the Rockland State Hospital in Orangeburg, NY, read an interesting news item from Bombay in the New York Times. At a provincial medical conference, a special prize was awarded to Dr. R.A. Hakim for his paper on indigenous drugs in the treatment of mental diseases. The indigenous drugs were from the plant Rauwolfia serpentina, and the special prize was a gold medal for treating more than 700 schizophrenics. The drugs were derived from the snake-like roots of a small bush that is native to India. Its powdered extract had long been used in folk medicine to quiet babies and to treat insomnia. Indian holy men, including Mahatma Gandhi, were habitual users, as they found it helped them attain states of introspection and meditation. At around this time, the Swiss pharmaceutical firm Ciba isolated the active ingredient from the plant, an alkaloid called reserpine, to treat people with high blood pressure. Each purified crystal was equivalent in activity to more than 10,000 times its weight in the crude drug. A few months after Kline read the New York Times announcement, Ciba marketed the drug as Serpacil for high blood pressure. Kline was a bold, energetic, and often controversial innovator in psychiatric research. He tested the drug on many of his psychiatric patients. The results were highly variable. Several showed dramatic improvement, and most became sedated to varying degrees and indifferent to events around them. He went on to transform Rockland State Hospital from a regular state mental institution into a leading research center. Kline became an evangelist in promoting the drug to treat schizophrenics. For his pioneer efforts in introducing the use of tranquilizers to the practice of psychiatry in the United States, he received the prestigious Albert Lasker Medical Research Award in 1957. On the recommendation of the Commissioner of Mental Health in New York State, reserpine was routinely administered to all 94,000 patients in the state psychiatric hospitals. The drug, however, had serious side effects, particularly permanent movement disorders, and its use was discontinued in the early 1960s. But it was the drug's effect on mood in non-psychiatric patients that threw a spotlight on the chemical mix at the brain synapses. As millions of patients in the U.S. with high blood pressure were now taking Ciba's Serpacil, it soon became apparent that reserpine precipitated a severe depression in many people, with some even committing suicide. Investigations into reserpine showed by 1955 that it reduces the level of the three major monoamines, serotonin, dopamine, and noradrenaline, now called norepinephrine, in the brain. This was a major illumination, and the investigators were able to figure out how it happened. Reserpine causes these amines to leak out from little storage pouches called synaptic vesicles at the terminal endings of neurons at the synapse, and they are broken down by the enzyme monoamine oxidase, MAO. The resultant deficiency causes the depression. For an antidepressant to be uncovered, the key was to find a way to inhibit this MAO enzyme. In the early 1950s, clinical studies were being done in Europe to test how effective a new drug called iproniazid would be in treating tuberculosis. Scientists discovered that the drug was extremely effective, but they also noticed a surprising side effect. The patients taking it experienced euphoria. Klein, upon learning about the odd side effect, saw the potential and conducted a clinical trial to test iproniazid, a known MAO inhibitor, as an antidepressant. The patient response was astonishing. In April 1957, Klein's team reported the results of their experiments with 26 patients that revealed iproniazid to be the first drug of value in treating depression. It is difficult today, in this era of institutional review boards, informed consent, and governmental regulation, not to marvel at the directness, simplicity, and lack of restraint possible at that time. Ethics, responsibility, and competence were matters that were, for better or worse, completely up to the clinician who undertook the trial. Who gets the credit? The pride of authorship and the credit for discovery are powerful dynamics among researchers. The circumstances surrounding the press announcements and the presentation at the regional meeting of the American Psychiatric Association in Syracuse, New York, of the evident value of iproniazid led to a long and bitter conflict between the participants. Harry Loomer, the physician in charge of the clinical unit involved at Rockland State Hospital, read the paper at the meeting 7, but the New York Times incorrectly credited the presentation to Klein. At a press conference in New York a few days earlier, details of the success of the trial had been provided principally by Klein. Loomer was infuriated, and the New York Times printed a retraction. Another member of the team, John Saunders, a physician and clinical pharmacologist who supervised the project and had correctly attributed the mode of action of iproniazid to monoamine oxidase activity, also felt exploited. The following year, under his single authorship, Klein published a paper on the clinical experience with iproniazid. The spark of discontent burst into flame in 1964 when Klein, for work with iproniazid, became the single recipient of a second Lasker Award. The accompanying citation said, "Literally hundreds of thousands of people are leading productive, normal lives who, but for Dr. Klein's work, would be leading lives of fruitless despair and frustration." Loomer and Saunders objected, saying they had made the discovery, but the awards committee was unrelenting. 17 years of litigation followed. A jury ruled for Loomer and Saunders, and the State Court of Appeals upheld that ruling and finally laid the case to rest in 1981. Because iproniazid, Marsalid, had already been marketed since 1952 as an anti-tubercular drug, psychiatrists were able to obtain supplies as soon as they heard of its antidepressant properties. Within 1 year of Klein's report, more than 400,000 patients had received the drug for treatment of depression. A gratified Klein observed that probably no drug in history was so widely used so soon after announcement of its application in the treatment of a specific disease. The report of a small number of cases of jaundice, most likely a coincidental epidemic of infectious hepatitis, led to the withdrawal of iproniazid from the American market by the manufacturer Hoffmann-La Roche in 1961. It was then replaced by more potent MAO inhibitors, such as Nardil and Parnate. MAO inhibitors, MOIs, increase brain levels of norepinephrine, serotonin, and dopamine. Iproniazid's antidepressant effect is due to this mechanism. The discovery that depression can be lifted by agents that inhibit the enzyme MAO was a major breakthrough in the recognition of depression as a common disease. Moreover, MAO inhibitors had an important impact on the development of modern biological psychiatry. The use of MAO inhibitors in the treatment of depression became severely restricted in the face of unexpected consequences. Complex, sometimes severe, and often unpredictable interactions with other food-derived amines, particularly those in cheese, chemically related to adrenaline and thus liable to raise blood pressure, sometimes sufficient to precipitate strokes or heart failure, made their medical use difficult and potentially hazardous. Fortunately, only a few years later, the next important and now dominant class of antidepressant compounds, the tricyclics, was introduced. Tricyclic antidepressants. Roland Kuhn at the Cantonal Psychiatric Clinic in Münsterlingen, Switzerland, was a distinguished and cultivated 38-year-old psychiatrist who had been trained in psychoanalysis. Despite this training, his clinical experiences had led him to seriously consider the possibility that mental illnesses were caused by biological factors. At the request of the Geigy Pharmaceutical Company in Basel, he began testing a drug called imipramine, one of the tricyclics, so named for their chemical structure, characterized by 3 interlinked carbon rings that had originally been synthesized with antihistaminic activity in mind. Kuhn set out in 1950 to investigate it for use in treatment of schizophrenic patients. Over the next several years, Kuhn made an astute observation of an apparent paradoxical effect. Rather than exerting a sedative effect, imipramine did exactly the opposite. It served as a stimulant. A few quiet, withdrawn schizophrenics became less withdrawn and began reacting to their hallucinations, hence harder to handle. Rather than concluding that the drug had made them worse, Kuhn took the view that the drug had eased the depressed component in these patients, resulting in what might be considered a normal reaction to hallucinations. He therefore decided to reevaluate the drug by trying it in patients who were primarily depressed and not necessarily schizophrenic. The results were dramatic and breathtaking. Deeply depressed patients were resurrected to activity, socialization, contentment, and accessibility. The patients themselves spoke of a miracle cure. Kuhn was candid in acknowledging that chance admittedly had something to do with the discovery of imipramine. Good fortune, too, played a part. But in also declaring that a discovery does not arise of its own accord out of a particular scientific solution. This experienced psychiatrist paid tribute as well to Pasteur's dictum, "Chance favors the prepared mind." Thus was born a class of drugs that would have a profound effect on millions of patients suffering from depression, thanks to both chance and sagacity. Kuhn's sagacity, in this case, was in his ability to see the drug's potential for use as an antidepressant, even though that potential good use was masked by its failure as a sedative. Prozac Nation. Depression was recognized as having biological causes, and the search was on for even more effective drugs to treat it. It is remarkable that over the next 30 years, so little progress was made. The most notable advance was the introduction of agents that have, in essence, the same mechanism of action as the original tricyclic antidepressants, but with fewer side effects. These are called selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, or SSRIs, and they include the well-known brand-name drugs Prozac, Paxil, and Zoloft. Prozac's generic name is fluoxetine, Paxil's is paroxetine, and Zoloft's is sertraline. SSRIs prolong serotonin's neurotransmission by inhibiting its reuptake by the nerves that release it, which is the normal way that serotonin signaling is terminated. Prozac was the first SSRI approved by the FDA in December 1987, and the others soon followed. Prozac in particular became a buzzword for the new zeitgeist, built on society's acceptance of the chemical regulation of mood. By 1994, according to Newsweek, the drug had attained the familiarity of Kleenex and the social status of spring water. Organizations like the National Alliance for the Mentally Ill and the National Depression and Manic Depressive Association assert that these disorders are illnesses like diabetes or heart disease, not weaknesses or failures of character. Americans are coming to think of depression as an illness like any other, a topic discussed on dates and at dinner parties. As of 2006, about 40 million people had taken Prozac since it was introduced in 1988. In 2001, it had retail sales of $2.7 billion in the United States, with similar figures posted by Zoloft and other agents. In 2004, antidepressants became the best-selling category of prescription medicines in the United States. Global sales totaled $20 billion that year. In 2006, at least 7 million Americans were on antidepressants. The search continues for even better drugs that are more effective and have fewer side effects. Despite a better understanding of drug effects on neurotransmission, a trial and error approach endures in the development of new drugs. What physically initiates and sustains depression remains poorly understood, largely because an animal model for human depression does not exist. Animal tests do not mimic anything like human depression. Not only do antidepressants affect different parts of the brain in animals and humans, but in people, depression has a strong emotional and cognitive component. Yet, even with more sophisticated laboratory investigations, additional serendipitous discoveries will be needed for real progress to take place. Eric Nestler of the Division of Molecular Psychiatry at the Yale University School of Medicine acknowledged that reality when he wrote in 1998, "It is likely that truly novel antidepressants will be developed either by luck once again or by revealing more about the basic mechanisms that underlie depressive syndromes."